John Parker Boyd. Now, John Parker Boyd actually is more important to the War of 1812 than he is to the American Revolutionary War. Now, if you come to this channel often, you'll know I actually consider the War of 1812 to be part of the greater American founding. People may argue with that, but Parker Boyd was alive during the American Revolution, but he was a very young man, and although he wanted to join as a soldier, he was too late. He came of age just as the war ended, but he wanted to be a soldier, so he does something very curious. He goes to India, and he actually fights as a mercenary in India, mostly for the British, actually, but not really directly for the British. At the time, the British were kind of taking over India, and they were using the different heads of state. The name escapes me, but essentially the kings of different Indian provinces, and Parker Boyd would sign on with different provinces of India to fight with, but again, essentially for Great Britain. And he does this for almost 20 years. Over 15 years he's doing this in India, until eventually Britain basically takes over, and there's no real need for his fighting anymore. During this time, John Parker Boyd established himself as a really important cavalry commander, and he has wild success over there. It's really impressive. He makes a good amount of money, and then after the wars are over, he sells off all his goods and travels back to the United States, but he still wants to be a soldier. So he gets back, and he goes to the American government and says, hey, I heard you started an army while I was gone, back when John Adams was here. And this is during the Thomas Jefferson administration, just about the time James Madison is going to become president, is when Parker Boyd returns, having missed all of Washington and Adams and the majority of Jefferson. And he comes back and he says, okay, I'm ready to fight. You need me? And they're like, yeah, we got some troubles in the Northwest with Tecumseh. And I don't talk about Tecumseh enough on this channel, but we have spoken recently about William Henry Harrison, who was fighting Tecumseh, and Boyd would go join him and actually become an aide-de-camp to William Henry Harrison, essentially the number 2 at the Battle of Tippecanoe, which we know later on would be the slogan for Harrison's presidential campaign, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. This was Tippecanoe and John Parker Boyd, and Boyd did very well there. Not long after this, the War of 1812 breaks out. Like a few months later, the War of 1812 breaks out. He ends up going to New York, and John Parker Boyd is appointed a Brigadier General in the American Army at this point. He goes over to New York. He has great success fighting on Lake George. Again, really earning his stripes here as a commander. And then something a little unfortunate happens. See, John Parker Boyd was not the ranking commander in New York during the War of 1812, but James Wilkinson, who is kind of an anti-hero in American history, and we've talked about him before. He was a secret agent for the Spanish and also the commander of the the American Army. But he is leading the War of 1812, and he falls ill and cannot command. And then Morgan Lewis, who is another major general in the American Army, unfortunately, there is some troop movements, and he goes to another part of New York. And suddenly, out of nowhere, John Parker Boyd finds himself in charge of this section of the American Army, essentially an army of his own. But then he attends the Battle of Crysler's Farm, and he was not prepared for this. He was not prepared to take the lead. His men were not trained well enough, which arguably could be his fault, arguably couldn't be his fault. We will get into that in a second. But he goes to the Battle of Crysler's Farm, where he outnumbers the British 3-1 and suffers a horrible defeat. Fortunately, the war ends not too long after. The Americans win, huzzah, and John Parker Boyd then is kind of being taunted, not taunted, but his career is tarnished because it's one battle. And again, he's literally fought around the world having great success, but this one battle tarnishes his reputation. He is given all the blame. He does write a fairly lengthy pamphlet afterwards defending his behavior, but it's up in the air. Was he a great general who made one mistake, or did he have a lot of good luck early in his career, and this really shows his true colors? There was a quote I had read from Winfield Scott, who was another American. He's hard to call American founder. He came up at this point during this war and really was important later on as a commander of the American Army. But Winfield Scott kind of criticized him as a very good officer, not a good leader. When he's actually put in command, he fell through, although he used fairly harsh words. Either way, that's at this point, Boyd retires to his farm, but then passes away just a few years later. Of course, we've covered decades of his life in this brief conversation, though it might not feel that way. So that is a summary of the life of John Parker Boyd.